They petitioned the government repeatedly, filed land claims, and tried every legal avenue to have their rights recognized, but their pleas largely fell on deaf ears. By the 20th century, the original Mohawk territory had been reduced to a small, fragmented area. The flashpoint arrived in 1989. The town of Oka announced plans to expand its private, members-only golf course from 9 holes to 18. This expansion was planned to go right through the pines, directly over the ancestral burial ground. For the people of Kanesatake, this was the final straw. They had already lost so much of their land, and now a sacred site was being threatened for the sake of a luxury golf course. The community protested. They tried to negotiate, but the mayor of Oka, Jean Ouellette, was determined to proceed. He saw it as a simple issue of property development. The Mohawks saw it as the desecration of their heritage and a profound act of disrespect. When it became clear that legal and political channels were failing, the Mohawks decided to take direct action. On March 11, 1990, as the snow was still on the ground, a group of people from Kanesatake erected a barricade on a local dirt road, blocking access to the pines. They were determined to stop the bulldozers. At first, the protest was small and peaceful. But as spring turned into summer, the situation grew more tense. The barricade remained, and the Mohawk group became more organized, with many members donning camouflage and adopting the name Mohawk Warriors. They weren't just protesting, they were asserting their sovereignty over the land. The town of Oka obtained 2 court injunctions ordering the barricade to be taken down. The Mohawks refused. They argued that Canadian courts had no jurisdiction over their sovereign territory. The stage was set for a confrontation. On the morning of July 11, 1990, the Secret du Québec, the provincial police force, decided to enforce the court order. About 100 officers, armed with tear gas and concussion grenades, advanced on the barricade. They demanded the Mohawks disperse. The warriors, numbering around 30, refused. What happened next is still debated, but a firefight broke out. Tear gas canisters were fired into the woods, and shots were exchanged. When the smoke cleared, one person was dead. Corporal Marcel Lemay, a 31-year-old officer with the SQ. The police retreated, abandoning their vehicles and equipment, leaving the warriors in control of the barricaded area. The death of Corporal Lemay instantly escalated the crisis from a local dispute to a national emergency. In a show of solidarity, the Mohawks of Kahnawake, a nearby reserve, blockaded the Mercier Bridge. This bridge was a major commuter artery into Montreal, and its closure caused chaos, stranding thousands of commuters and effectively cutting off parts of the city. This act dramatically raised the stakes and brought the crisis into the daily lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the Montreal area. Tensions skyrocketed. Frustrated local residents held angry protests, some of which turned violent. Effigies of Mohawk warriors were burned, and rocks were thrown at Mohawk vehicles trying to leave the reserve. The conflict was no longer just in the woods of Oka. It was on the streets, fueled by frustration, racism, and fear. With the provincial police unable to resolve the situation, Quebec's Premier Robert Bourassa called in the Canadian Armed Forces. On August 20th, over 4,000 soldiers were deployed in Operation Salon. It was a shocking sight for many Canadians. Their own army, with armored vehicles and heavy weaponry, moving against its own citizens on Canadian soil. The military surrounded both Kanesatake and Kahnawake, setting up checkpoints and tightening the perimeter. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. For weeks, the world watched as Mohawk warriors and Canadian soldiers stood face to face, separated by razor wire. Negotiations were ongoing, but they were difficult and often broke down. The Mohawks demanded recognition of their land rights and sovereignty, while the government demanded the barricades come down and the rule of law be respected. Inside the barricades, life was a struggle. Food and medical supplies were limited. The warriors, along with many women and children who had chosen to stay, were isolated and under constant psychological pressure. They were portrayed in some media as criminals or terrorists, but for them and for many indigenous people across the country, they were heroes, defenders of their land and their people. The crisis sparked solidarity protests from indigenous communities all across Canada. It showed that the issues at Auckland rights, sovereignty, and unresolved historical grievances were not isolated problems, but were shared by First Nations from coast to coast. As the standoff dragged on into September, the situation became untenable. The military was slowly closing in. On September 26, 1990, after 78 days, the crisis reached its conclusion. The remaining warriors at Kanesatake decided to disengage. It wasn't a surrender in the traditional sense. In a final dramatic act, they burned their weapons, held a ceremony, and then walked out of the treatment center where they had been holed up. Chaos erupted as they emerged, with soldiers tackling and arresting many of the men, women, and children. The images were jarring and broadcast around the world. The Oka crisis was over. So, what was the aftermath? In the short term, several Mohawks faced criminal charges, though many were eventually acquitted. The golf course expansion was canceled, and the federal government eventually purchased the disputed land to prevent future development, although it has still not been officially transferred to Kanesatake. But the long-term impact was far more significant. The Oka crisis was a wake-up call for Canada. It brutally exposed the deep-seated issues in the relationship between the government and Indigenous peoples. It forced a national conversation that had been ignored for too long. In the years that followed, the crisis directly led to the creation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. This was a massive 5-year study that produced a landmark report calling for a complete restructuring of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, including recommendations on self-government and land claims. While not all of its recommendations have been implemented, it set a new agenda for Indigenous affairs in the country. The crisis also inspired a new generation of Indigenous activists and leaders. It showed that direct action could be a powerful tool to bring about change and force governments to listen. The spirit of Oka can be seen in later movements like Idle No More and the land defense protests we see today. However, the scars of Oka remain. For the communities of Kanesatake and Kanawake, the trauma of the standoff, the military occupation, and the divisions it caused are still felt. The core issue of the land itself is still not fully resolved. The Oka crisis was not just a historical event, it's a living legacy. It's a reminder of the complex, often painful history of Canada and the ongoing struggle for justice, recognition, and reconciliation for Indigenous peoples. It showed the world that a small group of determined people standing up for what they believe is sacred can challenge a nation and change the course of history. Thank you for watching. The story of the Oka crisis is a vital part of Canadian history, and it's important that we continue to talk about it and learn from it. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into historical events. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks again, and see you next time.